One of the things I really try to do here on the Spector Creative channel is hang out on the comment section. If you've ever commented, you've probably noticed I've commented back because, well, I'm a big fan of fans. I'm a fan too, and I think interaction between content creators and those who are watching it is part of the entire process and a necessary part, like when we used to have letter columns in comic books. Thank you, Eric Larson, for still doing that. All right, well, Mr. Caliber asked about waiting for a video explaining the strength and weaknesses of the 5 points of articulation from a toy maker's point of view. And absolutely, let's talk about that. So 5 points of articulation, or also called 5POA on message boards, basically means articulation at the arms, the legs, and the head, hence 5 points, as opposed to a super articulated figure that has like 30 points of articulation. And Star Wars tends to be the line most people think of, although it's not the only one. There's been tons of lines with 5 points of articulation, and there have been lines before and after Star Wars that have been 5 points of articulation. But Star Wars kind of did it best in terms of character selection as well as accessories that worked with these figures, including things like carrying cases and vehicles, which we're going to get into in a moment because it's a very big part of it. There were obviously lines after Star Wars that had this, and some that never even made it to market. But 5 points of articulation was born out of the 1970s, and to understand it, we need to do a little toy history. So let's dive in. What was the origins of 5 points of articulation? Why do toy companies do it? All right, so the first action figures were G.I. Joe. I mean, unless you count, non-articulated toy soldiers from the 1800s or even wooden things that Romans played with. And in the 1970s, these 12-inch Joes shrunk down to 8-inch for the popular Mego line, which had characters in soft good outfits, soft goods meaning a cloth outfit, which even was used to replicate skin, characters like Tarzan, which was a huge plus for those who practiced being a never nude. And while 8-inch figures weren't the only ones in the 1970s, Mego was the biggest. There were other 12-inch figures, like, of course, the $6 Million Man with the being able to look through his eye device action feature that was one of the most popular of the entire decade, and other figures like the Evel Knievel Stunt Cycle, which was designed really to be a figure and motorcycle in one, not necessarily an action figure that was going to go off and have adventures without his bike. Of course, on the other side of the country, Mattel was pumping out their figures too, quite literally, in the case of Pulsar, who was meant to be their version of the $6 Million Man, and then, of course, Big Jim, which was a male Barbie who could basically do anything and be anything, with different outfits sold separately. Alright, so why did Star Wars get shrunk in the wash? Why did it come out 3 3/4 amongst all these large figures? Well, there's two strategies behind doing an action figure line. When you're at the brainstorm or you're at base one and you're deciding on a new toy line to create, there's two ways to do an action figure line. One is to make the line based around figures. Something like Fortnite is like this, where you really only see figures, there's no playsets, there's no vehicles, maybe a carrying case. Then you have a vehicle-based action figure line. Mission Fleet from Hasbro right now with Star Wars is a great example. One, because it's currently in market, and two, it's a line that's all about figures and vehicles interacting. Yes, the figures work by themselves, and the vehicles. Another version would be Galoob's Action Fleet line back in the early 90s. So yes, the figures are articulated, the figures do work by themselves, and you can buy packs of just figures to add to your collection, and obviously they're collectible and they can be avatars for the imagination and kids can have adventures with them. But the line was really based around putting the figures inside of vehicles, and the vehicle was the main product you were buying. The figures were accessories to the vehicle, much the same way an action figure might have a gun or a rope as an accessory. So while they were cool and they sort of stood on their own and had sometimes articulation at the waist or the arms, they weren't meant to be the main toy. They were meant to be a part of the larger toy of the vehicle, hence a vehicle-based figure line. Something like Micro Machines or Micro Machines Star Wars is not an action figure line. It's a fully vehicle line. Yes, you might get a slug figure permanently attached, but it's not removable and it doesn't have any points of articulation. It's just sort of part of the vehicle. So a line like this is not considered an action figure line. It's actually considered a wheels line or vehicle line. Yes, I know that TIE fighters and AT-ATs or AT-ATs don't have wheels, but they're sold in what's the industry calls the wheels aisle, which tends to be dominated by something like Hot Wheels or Jada's diecast line. So it really is about where it's sold in the play pattern. The Star Wars ships, like the Micro Machines, or the current Mattel line of Star Wars ships and Star Wars character cars, are all sold in the wheels aisle, not in the action figure aisle. Hence, these are not action figures with vehicles, these are just vehicles. So something like Mission Fleet again, now we're back to figures with vehicle play. And this is an action figure line that is based around vehicles. Vehicles are the main purchase, the figures are just your accessory that's going inside of it. And that's very important. We're going to come back to that point in a moment because that's part of the emotional connection between the child and the product. All right, so let's go back to 1978 and the very first Star Wars figures. And that's because there were none in 1977 except for that Christmas pack, but that didn't ship till 78 either. All right, so we all remember fondly buying all of these action figures, and they tended to be the biggest part of our collection. And if you were a Star Wars toy fan in this time, that's what you were getting. But it's not what Kenner wanted you to get. They thought that this, and even hopefully this were going to be your main purchase. And we all got ships, but the way Kenner designed the line was around the ships. It wasn't an action figure line the way Mego or Big Jim was. Well, Big Jim only had Big Jim, but G.I. Joe, other toy lines from the 70s, Kenner thought that the star of the movie was going to be the ships. The thing kids were going to remember the most were the ships, not the people. So they wanted this to be the main purchase, which is why the figures in most of the early material were called mini action figures. The idea that they were just there to go inside the ship. They weren't really there to play with by themselves. They did have large-scale figures, because large-scale was really what action figure lines were all about, and eventually the figures were just called action figures once it was obvious after a year or two that the figures were outselling the vehicles. And eventually with things like Power of the Force 1, things like the collector coin were added, which really played up the fact that the figures were what was collectible, not the vehicles. But that's not how the line was designed. It was designed, and Mark Bardot from Hasbro Kenner has discussed this. He was on the line for 30 years. This is him back in the 70s when he helped create the line, and he's talked about how, yeah, the whole line was designed based on me holding my hand like this and saying this is how big the figure should be in order to make the vehicles at a price point that we can sell. So, fast forward to today, and we still get 3 3/4 figures, but they're not always 5 POA. Sometimes they're as much as 30 POA, 30 points of articulation. And that means they're highly posable, and they have lots of accessories that clip on or they can hold in their hand. There are still versions of the same characters that are 5 POA, and as the original question that inspired this video at the beginning, why do toy companies sort of prefer 5 POA to highly articulated 3 3/4 figures? And it's obviously not just with the Star Wars brand. We see other brands that take advantage of the 5 POA system. And really, it's about cheap versus expensive. A 5 POA figure is way less expensive to make, and it's all because of piece count. So toys come out of a plastic injected molding machine like this, and the more parts a figure have, the first one being slug figures, now you're up to figures with interchangeable arms and heads, and then when you get to things like Marvel Legends or highly articulated 3 3/4 figures, you're getting more and more parts coming out of what's called a sprue. That's what we're looking at. This is a plastic sprue, which is spit out of a plastic injection molded machine. Well, not spit, but it's the result. And the more parts you have, the more assembly you have. And that's where a huge part of the expense comes from, is labor. And labor constantly goes up, which is why we see action figure prices going up. It's not because there's more or less plastic or more or less deco, but the cost of labor is increasing. And at retail, if you see something like this, which is a highly articulated 3 3/4 figure with lots of parts, every joint, every piece that needs to be assembled, and you see it hanging right next to a 6-inch figure, and the price difference is negotiable, maybe $6, $7, maybe even less. And that's the problem, is that it really costs the same amount to make a 3 3/4 figure as it does a 6-inch. Yes, a 6-inch figure is going to have more plastic physically, but plastic is not the main cost. It's assembly, it's the labor. The other reason that 3 3/4 and 5 points of articulation work so well for kids is because of the grip. Kids and dexterity has to be something that's thought about. It's the same reason that a Coke can looks like a Coke can. It's designed around the human hand. And the ability for a child to grip a figure and not have the parts go all over, and then put it inside the vehicle, that's the emotional connection I was alluding to before. And that's the key to a vehicle-based action figure line. We all dream about being the pilot of the Millennium Falcon, right? I mean, come on. And especially for kids, this is very aspirational. So if they can have an action figure that fits inside of the cockpit, this is part of the emotional connection and the way they can see themselves in the play, what's called being an avatar for the imagination. Not avatar like this big blue guys or, anything else. What I mean is that an avatar is the way you see yourself. So kids being able to put a figure inside of a vehicle is extremely aspirational, and that is why Star Wars was designed that way in the 70s. Now, the price value obviously is leading to 3 3/4 going away and 6-inch being seen as the default line, especially because vehicles aren't really being produced that much. But 3 3/4 is a lot cheaper to make, especially when you have less assembly parts and you have 5 points of articulation versus many, and you can cram them in vehicles much easier. And that emotional connection and that play pattern is why 5 points of articulation was created. I hope this video clarified. If it didn't, let me know in the comment section and I'll make another one. And leave some comments. I love hearing and responding to them all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.